All right, welcome everyone. Today our Wisconsin Department of Public Instruction webinar is on functional communication training. I'm Daniel Parker. I'm the Autism and Family Engagement Consultant with the Department of Public Instruction. I'm joined here today by Ellen Franzone. Thank you, Ellen, for being here today.
Thanks for having me.
So let's go ahead and get started in our discussion. A couple housekeeping really quickly. If you are using your phone line, please mute your phone line by pressing *6. There is some information about the access code in the information I had sent out previously. If you're having trouble with the GoToWebinar system, there's not much we can do on our end today, but you can call the GoToWebinar helpline at 1-800-263-6317. There's also a link there that you can click on, and I'll send that link if you need any support. You should have received an email with handouts. I know a few of you have registered in the last 24 to 48 hours. I'll make sure you get the link and all the information post-webinar with the link to handouts. I did type it in the chat box, so in your chat box you should be able to find that link to the webinars. If you didn't get that, you can type that in the question box, and at some point during the webinar I can send that out again. So today we're going to be talking about the importance. I'm going to do a quick overview of the importance of using evidence-based practices. Functional communication training is a well-established evidence-based practice for students with autism. We're going to be spending the bulk of our time going over the step-by-step instructions that the National Professional Development Center on Autism Spectrum Disorder has laid out on how to implement functional communication training. We do have some nice tips and tweaks, and we'll be talking about that along the way and then as a summary. And then I have some resources for further study that you can follow up on. A couple of assumptions, just to be clear. A couple of assumptions for this webinar is that one of them, when we talk about communication and what communication is that however a student is communicating with you, it's because it's provided with them with some success in the past. So for example, if you have students who are not communicating very skillfully, they may be pulling, grabbing, biting, yelling, crying. That is a form of communication. And one of the reasons those things are happening is because for whatever reasons, they have met with some success with that communication in the past, and it may be the easiest thing for them to access. So our goal is to teach students to learn more skillful ways of communicating. Ellen, would you have anything to kind of add in on that line of thinking?
Yeah, I think just that idea that behavior is a form of communication, especially when we're talking about any kind of practices that target behaviors that can be challenging in the classroom or that can bring teams to the point where they just don't know where to come at the student, and don't know kind of what to do next. I think just that remembering that behavior is a form of communication and that all students deserve an opportunity to be able to communicate basic wants and needs, basic protests, that kind of groundwork, I think has to be where we start. Kids deserve a functional communication system, and it's our job to provide them that and to teach them how to use it.
Thank you. In addition, when we talk about behavior, that can be an extremely loaded term. When we say the term behavior, I personally attempt to talk more about behavior differences, because when we use the term deficit, there's a lot of loaded language that can be used there. Just my choice. I really love the term skillful and unskillful behavior. I've said it before. I heard Mark Sweets from Disability Rights Wisconsin use that term a while back, a couple of years ago, and I've just completely used it as such a useful way to talk about a student as having unskillful behavior, because then the goal is always to teach a student more skills. We're teachers. That's what we do. Teachers, speech language pathologists, adults, parents. We are there to help students learn more skillful behavior. And it just frames it a little bit better. Anything that you do, you need to teach. There's a difference between teaching and telling. So certainly functional communication training is a system for teaching. And I just found this recently. This is actually from a dear colleague of mine sent this along, and it was sent from one of the EBD consultants in the field, I believe. Terry Derry, who's retired from our department as the emotional behavior disability consultant, sent this to our team, and I just fell in love with this little graphic. And it made me think of fairness, because I always have that question, well, that's not fair to let this student do that? And we might get into that kind of conversation today. And I just love that little cartoon graphic there that shows here's what equality is, and here's what, for me, I would say this is what fairness is. So I just wanted to share that cartoon with us. It goes along with some of our assumptions. I'm not going to be going over these terms, but they are in your handouts. When I say MPDC-ASD, that's the National Professional Development Center on Autism Spectrum Disorder. And I'll probably talk about AIM a lot. That's the Autism Internet Modules. And FBA is Functional Behavior Assessment. So those are going to be the terms we're going to be using a lot today. Again, another one that we'll be using is generalization. And we'll talk a little bit about that more, but that term is in your packet. I'm going to move along a little bit here. So at the beginning of these webinars, I like to give a quick example right away of what are we talking about before we go too far into it. So let's look at a case study, and really quick, in your handouts and on the Autism Internet Module website, I sent you these printouts from the Autism Internet website, and you can't see this too good, but I really encourage you to read along with this. It's a much more detailed summary of these case studies. And actually, I'll kind of go through this really quickly. So Ben is a 6-year-old kindergartner with autism. Prior to starting kindergarten, he attended a community preschool for 2 hours a day. He did well in his environment, and his teacher did not have any concerns with behavior. But in kindergarten, Ben started exhibiting some interfering behaviors during PE class. Several times per week, he would run from the gym and try to leave the school. Occasionally, this also happened in the lunchroom. Ben's team decided that a functional behavior assessment was needed to determine why he was fleeing PE and lunch. They had several ideas and hypotheses. For example, maybe he did not like the activity. Maybe he was avoiding the teachers. A thorough FBA determined Ben was fleeing to avoid noise levels in the gym and cafeteria. His speech therapist and teacher, who both knew him well, discussed what kind of communication act they could teach. Ben thought, teach Ben that would be easy for him to use when he was feeling uncomfortable with the noise. Although Ben was verbal, his language skills were delayed, and he frequently relied on other methods of communication. They decided to provide him with pictures of headphones, which he could hand to the PE teacher to obtain sound-reducing headphones. The picture was attached to the wall of the gym and the cafeteria with Velcro, close to where Ben usually sat. When functional communication training was implemented, a support person started going to PE and lunch with Ben's class. She watched for antecedents to Ben's flight. So they were looking at what are the things that are happening before he runs out of the classroom. And the team identified that during the FBA, these included free time playing when children started yelling at one another, and the last 5 minutes of lunch as children finished eating and started talking and probably being noisy. The support person was able to prompt Ben to use the picture by physically walking him to the picture and walking him to the PE teacher cafeteria supervisor. Later, the prompt became more subtle, pointing to the picture, and Ben enjoyed the headphones. He thought they were like a pilot's, and they dampened the sound enough to allow him to stay in the gym and cafeteria. Functional communication training taught Ben how to use a communicative act to request a change in his environment that was functionally equivalent to fleeing the gym. So I know that that was a little bit hard to see, so I'm going to go over kind of what this case study went over, just so we can go back. So we're talking about a 6-year-old student with autism doing well in preschool, but in kindergarten, he starts running out of the gym class and sometimes from the lunchroom. His teachers conduct an FBA, a functional behavior assessment, and found the reason why this is happening is because of the loud noises. We're very, very overstimulating for this young student. So Ben is verbal, but he has difficulty with speech, and his team decided to just give him a picture so that he could use the picture and go over to the teachers in gym and lunch and hand the picture to the teachers, and then when he hands them the pictures, they give him some headphones to assist with loud noises. So basically, he used to just run out of the classroom when these noises were happening, and they're teaching him a replacement to that behavior. They taught him something more skillful that was a communicative act, and that had the exact same outcome as running out of the room. So instead of running out of the room and there's no more noise, you put on the headphones, much more appropriate. So I was just saying that I actually, this is actually a very functional skill into adulthood. I was in a meeting with an adult with autism, and a fire alarm actually went off, and she had her headphones in her bag, and put them on, and was able to not be overstimulated by the noise. And I've seen this often with adults as well. Could be earbuds, headphones, any type of thing. Do you have anything to kind of add to our scenario there?
No, I think that idea, we'll talk a little bit more about it. One of the pieces that's interesting, I think, about when we talk about functional communication training is just how important that preliminary piece is, which is really to take good data about that helps you identify the function. So really, what is it about Jim and the cafeteria that is sending that child out of the room, and then FBA will give you that information. So I know we're not talking specifically about FBA today, but I can't emphasize enough that really getting a clear understanding of what the function is really the #1 first step, and you're not going to get much farther.
So for any student that just runs out of the classroom, it might not be because of loud noises, is what you're saying. There could be all kinds of reasons why that could be happening.
Surely.
Yeah. And your response on what you're going to do to replace that is going to depend on the reason and the why of why that's happening. Fantastic.
That's right.
So it is important to mention that all of the practices, well, functional communication training is an evidence-based practice as identified through the National Professional Development Center on Autism Spectrum Disorder. I did a webinar at the beginning of the year that was in-depth, kind of going over those resources and other statewide resources. So I'd encourage you to kind of take a look at that. The NPDCASD, you can look up their website. They have really nice step-by-step instructions as well as implementation checklists. So I would highly recommend kind of taking a look at those step-by-step instructions we'll be referencing later. As you can see, there are a lot of different evidence-based practices that they've identified through the NPDCASD, functional communication training being one of them. You'll probably recognize lots of different things that you're doing in your schools there, and all of those have step-by-step instructions and implementation checklists. So I would highly recommend going back to that resource later. I should say that not every identified practice may be appropriate for every learner, and we need to think of the individual needs of learners. So when we're giving examples, it's always important to go back and think of your individual student. And even if you are implementing and it may not be working, we need to make sure we're implementing to fidelity. We need to make sure that we are actually doing functional communication training as the research shown effective. So those implementation checklists, when you start implementing, just go back to them. Have a conversation with your staff, maybe do some observations, and you can really, really pin down if you're implementing to fidelity. As Ellen said, I love what you said at the beginning, that when we talk about our assumptions, that students have a right to certain communication. And you mentioned the break cards. Why do you think it's important to teach students, well, you mentioned protest. Why is it important that students know how to protest?
I think all of us need a way essentially to be able to say, knock it off, because we all feel that way. We all need to be able to say, stop it and knock it off, and I don't want to do that. That's a basic human kind of communicative need, and students will make that need known one way or the other. So we need to give them easy ways for them to be able to say that, and we need to respect those communication attempts, which means to back off when they ask us to. So I think too often we are helping students get through their day. We are doing everything we can to move them through that day successfully, but we're not necessarily giving them the skill set to kind of have some ownership of that success. So I don't know.
No, beautiful. I love it. And we also touched on this before Ellen and I were talking before we started the webinar, and I'm not going to go over all these, but we also talked about, is it behavior or is it the disability? Well, the student knows better, and I kind of discuss where, well, if the traditional things that work with most kids aren't working, we have to do something new. We're going to have to teach something. Doesn't mean it's excused, though, because the other piece of that is people that say, well, he has autism, he can't help it. And just because that predestination versus predetermination, just because you have a disability does not mean you can't learn new skills. But it's a balance. You have to have clear expectations, but you also have to be teaching something more skillfully. And probably the most important thing is that relationship with the caregiver. you know, it's, to me, that I hear that, and we have actually started to collect, it's interesting, some data at DPI for all students feeling connected to schools and how that relates to their academic and just life skill outcomes. If they can connect to one adult in the building, they feel more belonging, more self-efficacy, and it really can make some huge differences. So just always a plug for that importance of relationships. Autism Internet modules, I'm not going to go in depth, but I would encourage you, if you want to see some video modules of functional communication training and other types of evidence-based practices, as well as a whole bunch of other type of content, the end modules are for you. It's free. You can sign up. They have all the step-by-step instructions and implementation checklists, as well as case studies and activities and discussion questions, all kinds of good stuff on those modules. And a lot of schools are using this for professional development, from everyone to the general ed teachers, special ed education, administrators, families, homeschool communication, using these modules to have a common language around some interventions that are happening at home versus school. So think about those pieces. And then just very quickly, of course, one reason these things are so important, it's not if you are going to have a child with autism in your classroom, it's when. We see this is happening more and more, that autism is just becoming a real national big thing. And I mean, I remember hearing people talk about that in the 90s. Now it's amazing. And in keeping in mind that all students are different, and if you met one person with autism, you've met one person with autism. So we just need to keep in mind that even though some students may have differences in communication abilities, it's going to be really specific to individual children. You know, I've talked, you know, I believe that it's important that we have expectations for students, but when all we're doing is kind of the same old thing, when students are communicating unskillfully and we are trying these things that work for most kids and they're not working, we need to step it up a little bit. And with that, we need to look at using positive behavior intervention and support, that PBIS, looking at using something that we know that works. And many of you may be using visual schedules. You may be using video modeling, but have you actually looked at any type of research or step-by-step instructions that say what is the best way to use this teaching method? And again, another final plug to go to those MPDC-ASD modules and really make sure we're implementing with fidelity. So let's move on to functional communication training. And here's a definition. And Ellen, walk us through this. What are the key pieces of functional communication training, if you were to describe it to someone who really is not familiar with it?
Well, I think when I was first introduced to the phrase FCT, it was not something that I was familiar with. And then as I read about it, I thought, oh, well, gosh, that's something that I certainly have done in the past. But as we explored it more and I learned more, you know, you just kind of grow in your profession. But it most certainly did emerge from the literature on functional behavior assessment. So that idea of really taking good data and then looking at the data and saying what do this tell us, and so and what do we know about why a student is doing this. And you know, one thing I wanted to make sure we talked a little bit about was that we talk often about doing FBAs when problems become fairly significant. And so as you listen to this today, I think I would certainly encourage teams to say, gosh, when can we teach an alternative communication act when behaviors maybe aren't so awful? You know, we're starting to see a student placing his head on his desk, and how can we teach him something there rather than he's tipping the desk over and he's running out of the room. So anyway, so it certainly did come out of FBA, and it is a systematic practice to replace what can be considered inappropriate behavior, so things like acts of aggression, fleeing the room, some behaviors that we see that really do make it hard sometimes in a classroom setting for the student or for others to learn. And it can also be used to replace other communication acts. I'm going to talk a little bit about that, with more appropriate, more skillful, more effective communicative behaviors. FCT is always implemented after an FBA has been conducted. Don't guess. Don't just guess. Don't say he's doing this because he doesn't want to do the worksheet and he hates it and he's trying to make us. Don't guess. Really take the time to take some good data and figure out kind of what is the function of the behavior. So it's always implemented after an FBA has been conducted. and it identifies and teaches a replacement behavior that is easy for the learner to use and serves the same purpose as the interfering behavior, but in a more appropriate way. So that, we're going to talk a lot about that. It has to be super easy for that kid to do, and it has to serve exactly the same purpose as the behavior does.
And I love what you said about start easy, right? We often try to implement an intervention with the hardest thing that that student has in that day because it's the most immediate thing for us.
Right.
But if we're teaching something new and we're learning something new, let's set us up for success and do something that's a little less difficult.
Yeah, and you know, I think especially typically if a student is engaging kind of in a less skillful behavior or maybe a more aggressive behavior, they may not be, if they're frustrated, if they're angry, if they're feeling some of those emotions, none of us are in our best place to then be able to access skills that are more challenging for us. So let's make it easy.
Great. Here's a link to the research base from the MPDC-ASD. I'm not going to go over all the research, but it is there. There's several research articles that you can look up, and I have some at the end of the webinar in the resource section as well, some research articles. So why we like FCT, Functional Communication Training. I like it because it's problem solving. I always love interventions that get you to figure out why is this happening and what can we do to teach more skillful behavior. I know as a speech-language pathologist, functional communication training. Were you taught this specifically, or did you come along the way in your training?
I was not taught this specifically, and I think a lot of that's because I think traditional SLP readiness does not always line up with kind of more behavioral techniques, and this is a more behavioral technique. On this slide, one thing that's a very kind of SLP thing to notice is you've referenced a couple times that it's a language-based intervention, and I would change that to a communication-based intervention, that we are not going to necessarily require students to use formal language, to use words, to use sign language, that it might be a picture exchange, it might be a gesture, it's going to be something, again, that's easy and that works and that can be understood by everybody. So we'll talk about some examples about that. Oh, look at that. Oh, clever, yeah.
Yeah, there we go. It's a communication-based intervention. Thank you. I learned so much from you. So, when we talk about needs of students with autism, it is often used to target extreme behavior, as we said. I mean, that's usually where people really are interested in it. But we are going to be talking about those examples where you need to also be thinking about using it just for any more skillful communication that's going to help that student. I don't know if you want to go through with the pre-linguistic learners, nonverbal. I mean, often we're using it for students that have some difficulties with basic communication.
Yep, that's right. And I think we to know again, it sounds so basic, but I think we do it so often with our students who maybe have cognitive disabilities or who are nonverbal, that we sometimes assume that they can't communicate. And so I think that understanding that we can teach simple ways for students to communicate and that that's our job, that's what I think you're getting at there, that it can be used for both pre-linguistic and verbal communicators.
So some of the resources you need, as we've said, you really do need the ability of someone on your team to conduct a functional behavior assessment. That is one of the steps. And we'll talk briefly about that, and I'll point you to some resources on that. We're going to be talking, we don't have the time, that could be a whole other 2-hour webinar, but functional behavior assessment is key. Knowledge of the student is very important, and I would say that if you're doing this, it's definitely strong to consider assistance and guidance from a speech and language pathologist.
Yeah, or whoever it is. I mean, certainly I think it's good to have an SLP on the team, obviously, but I think also connecting with whoever in your district or in your building is responsible for doing those FBAs, and I think having a clear understanding of who kind of guides that process is a good thing.
Great. I would also kind of argue that you also want to pinpoint someone to follow up with the fidelity, like name a person on your team who is going to be in charge of looking at the step-by-step instructions and doing an implementation checklist to say, hey, we've been implementing this for 3 weeks. Are we actually doing it the way the research showed to be effective? So again, looking at those step-by-step instructions. We want to understand, student sensory system. Where do you think knowledge of students' interests and routines and accommodations plays into this knowledge?
Well, I think it's certainly all of those questions are questions that should come up when you're doing a high quality FBA. So because what we need to know is what is the child's daily routine? What does the student do on a day-to-day basis? When the student is given this work, is it adapted? How is it presented to the student? There's lots that we need to know, details about kind of those arenas in which we see some of the behavior that we might want to take to a more skillful level. And so those are questions I think that definitely need to always be asked. And I think any of these treatments that we talk about or any of this teaching that we talk about needs to take place in kind of a high-quality teaching environment. And a high-quality teaching environment for students on the spectrum is always going to include an acknowledgement of any differences in their sensory system, and take advantage of the students' interests, and obviously acknowledge a routine or a schedule. So all those pieces, I think, are part of the puzzle when we're looking at how well we're teaching students on the spectrum.
So you can do functional communication training pretty much in any setting. I will point out on the AIM modules, it is listed as one of the home interventions. So parents listening, I mean, if you go to the Autism Internet Modules website, it's not just a school-based setting that these professionals that set up these modules determine it for. Now, certainly you might be in collaboration with your home-based team. There's going to be pieces with that. You still need the functional behavior assessment. But you can look at doing this in multiple settings. So let's get into the nitty-gritty here with the steps to implementation. All the steps are based and adapted from the National Professional Development Center on Autism Spectrum Disorders. This is just a screenshot of the MPDC-ASD. So you can see if you go to their website, you can also get this from the AIM website, but if you go to their website, they have the step-by-step instructions, and then you can kind of pick which area, which of those evidence-based practices you're looking at. They have little PDF files, and you can, the brief package is all those files together, but it has the evidence-based, the steps, the checklist, data sheets, everything you need. This is kind of what it looks like. So this is an example of just kind of what you can download. And I put all of those documents in the Google Docs folder, so you can access them there. But I would encourage you to just go to the MPDC-ASD website also. I'm going to run through what some of these steps are really quick. We're going to identify interfering behaviors, complete an FBA, identify a replacement behavior, design data collection, teach the replacement behavior, plan for generalization, determine level of prompting, reinforce skillful communicative attempts, and then we are also going to shape that communicative response and fade out our prompts as needed, increase time between replacement behavior and reinforcement, and monitor student progress. Okay, I hope you got all that. But we're going to go by step by step here. So let's talk about this first step is identifying the interfering behavior. So these are the things often that someone gets called in to do a functional behavior assessment for: grabbing, screaming, shouting, crying. But as Ellen, and I really appreciate this, Ellen, reminding us that that's not the only time you do a functional communication training. You can also do this for subtle, less clear forms of communication.
The piece I really like, that idea of leading, and I don't love the phrase autistic leading, but it's something that's used in the literature that we've all seen it, where students take your hand and pull you over to something and place your hand on what it is they want, which is a form of request. Certainly they're typically asking for something, but also can be certainly taken to a more skillful. It's a pretty non-skillful way to communicate. It's not very reciprocal. It's not very engaged with the other person. Sometimes it's described as using that person as a tool to get what they want rather than as an interaction. So I love the idea of using a system like this to teach a more skillful communication form.
All right. I appreciate the questions coming in too. I'm saving some of them, and we'll catch them when we kind of hit some of these areas. So here's a quick group activity, and we're going to pause a second and let you type in. So type into that chat question box. Start your priming thinking. What are some behaviors you would like to see either your child or your student be able to communicate in a more skillful manner? Does not have to be the knockout, drag out, big ones. It can be something simple. But what are some ideas that you have? And we'll come back in about 45 seconds. All right. I'm going to reply. I'm just going to, just so people can kind of see what some of these are, I'm just going to quickly kind of send to all some of these, so you guys can kind of see some of these responses here. Ellen, do you want to read a couple of those?
That you want to teach students to have their head up, that you might want to teach a student when he needs to take a break, or I assume that's to request a break, how to request all done versus running or avoiding. Somebody says, I'd like to see a student express their emotional state, so and verbal requests using either using language or using a speech generating device, emotional state.
So we have some great thinking there. Yeah. So hold on to those as you're kind of thinking about some of these as we kind of move along here. So you can kind of, we will have some breaks where you can prime your thinking with some of those. So the FBA piece. So this is going to be a quick overview. But, you know, functional behavior assessment, we're talking about direct observations, the ABC analysis, antecedent behavior consequence. Sometimes people use scatter plots, indirect observations, interviews, record reviews, questionnaires. There's a few different pieces to it. Really what you're doing is looking at why is this happening? What is the function of this interfering behavior, or whatever the behavior is that's occurring? Why is it happening? Some common functions include getting attention, trying to get away from something, or an activity or a demand, or it could be a noise or something like that, gaining access to something like an object or activity, or access to some type of sensory regulation. I know there's a lot of people that, and I think I've definitely been kind of moved by the discussions of thinking of a lot of the term people use self-stimulatory. I actually don't choose to use that term because I prefer movement needs. I think there's a pretty strong case that autism is a neurologically affects the neurological system, and some of the things that are happening are due to neurology, similar to other types of disabilities, and that the student, to say that they're self-stimulating kind of infers the student wants to do it, when maybe if they didn't do it, they would have a complete meltdown or it's some type of regulating behavior. Again, it doesn't mean that the student can't learn a more skillful way to regulate, or time or place, but that's all a part of kind of figuring out that functional behavior assessment. This is a nice kind of table, and I borrowed this from Terry Derry, the EBD consultant. And then you can just kind of see it's a very simplified view of functions, but it can be helpful as a very general discussion that you have a desired problem and you're either trying to obtain or get something, or escape or avoid something, and maybe you're trying to obtain something that's sensory or social or tangible, or escape those things. And with the social, we have to think of those differences. A lot of students with autism may have no difficulties with peers, but they have difficulties with adults, or vice versa. So it's very important to pay attention to those.
One thing that I always think, I think sometimes, especially when we're in classrooms and we are so busy and our plates are so full, it's one thing to talk about behaviors that are less skillful or more challenging kind of academically like this, and it's another thing when it's every day and you've got staff members that are getting hurt, or it's just kind of especially kind of making the work hard, which is really understandable. But one thing that I think when we look at behavior functions, what we have to try and do is take that deep breath. There is nothing on that chart saying that students engage in these behaviors just to make us mad, or just because they want to, that there really is almost always an underlying function. And I think just trying to kind of take that deep breath and know that we can get there and we can find it and we can make this more successful for the student is something to remember.
Definitely. For more information on completing an FBA, I actually did a webinar with Dr. Robert Payton from the Wisconsin Early Autism Project. Loved talking with him. Very intelligent man. We did a whole FBA webinar. You can request it through the DPI website if you want to sit through a 2-hour webinar recording. But in any case, highly recommend that. There's also some great stuff on web pages. There's trainings on FBAs. Do you have any specific resources or ideas if people want to learn more about FBAs?
I think that these are good ones. The other piece I would say is I talk to some teachers sometimes and they say, well, I'm just not entirely sure who's supposed to be doing the FBA. And I think sometimes just having that conversation within your district, you know, who does lead the FBA process? And we had a question earlier here too. Districts should have a clear identification of who takes that on. Is it a school psychologist? Is it the case manager? Is it the special education teacher? Those are fair questions to ask. And I know more and more districts too are trying to have kind of a comprehensive plan for how some of that is done. There's a lot of data to be collected. There's paperwork to be done. That's part of the process. And so having kind of a consistent way that's done across district, I think those are important conversations to be having kind of at a more systems level.
We had a question about how a functional behavior assessment would be done in a virtual school setting. I'm not sure how to answer that. You know, I would talk to your district. You know, there's a lot of factors there. You certainly can email me that question and more specifics, because it's really going to depend on whether you're homeschooling or you're in a publicly provided virtual school program. If it's a public school program and the child has an IEP, then the district is still responsible for providing a free and appropriate public education. So if it's at home, you know, then you're going to be looking at maybe some type of provider service that might be able to do that. You could certainly communicate with your school. I mean, there's probably a lot of answers, but feel free to email me that question or give me a call at some point and we can talk more in depth. I also would say with an FBA, I've been on both sides of it. I have gone into schools to do an FBA for a student I have not seen, do the observation and lead the team through it. I've also had people come in and do that. And one of the things I encourage, if you have done a functional behavior assessment and you're still having a lot of trouble, I would say don't be afraid to bring in someone else. Getting fresh eyes, someone who's really skillful and knowledgeable in that area, can really bring about a good functional behavior assessment person, I think, leads other people in thinking new thoughts about what's happening.
Yep. I would agree with that. And I think, you know, even if I think about my own self kind of parenting my own kids, it's hard. An FBA is asking you to say what happened immediately before this incident, what happened immediately after, and it's hard not to take off our own lens of what you intended to do or what you hoped to do or what the plan was to do, like all of those things, and to say, no, what actually happened, and to do that, you know, in as kind of non-judgmental and just report the facts, ma'am, kind of a way. And so a clean set of eyes, I think, does do that.
Yeah. The next step here, so once you've done your functional behavior assessment, is identifying the replacement behavior. And we're going to be drilling this home, but that replacement behavior has to have the same function as the interfering behavior. And we're going to give you some examples here on the next slide. And basically what this means is that student has to get the same outcome. And sometimes instead of saying antecedent behavior consequence, I use the term antecedent behavior outcome. Because what is the outcome of a child's behavior? Do they get away from the thing? Do they get the thing? What are they accessing? Are they feeling a feeling? What is it? And whatever the replacement is has to provide that same function, that same piece. So before we go into a couple of those examples, what are some different ways? I want you to think about what are some different ways a child can communicate, like using words. Because when we talk about different ways to teach communication, I used the term language earlier. That's one way to communicate. But if we're going to try to teach a student to communicate differently, I want you guys to generate any possible way you can think of a student communicate, just to broaden our thinking so we're not just teaching the student to say something else. That's the purpose of this quick activity. So what are some ways, and we'll take a 15-second break as you type in these answers. Thank you guys. I got more ideas than I thought. This is fantastic. People said PECs, drawing, pointing, eye gaze, looking, all behavior is communication, gestures, sign language, voice output devices. So think of your students or children and think of the ways they are able to communicate or are emerging or are fluent, and you need to be would you agree you need to be thinking about that when we're thinking of our replacement communication of what's going to work best for that student?
Absolutely. I think what's going to work best for that student and what's going to work best in this particular environment. So even going back to that case study that we just talked about, I like that in that case study that student has a picture and he's going to exchange it, as opposed to in a loud gym and in a loud cafeteria, all of a sudden expecting that student to access their verbal skills, to speak loud enough, to get the attention of a teacher, all of that. That makes it trickier, right? And so instead it's going to be you hand this picture, put it in his hand, and then you know that the teacher is going to understand that message. So, so I think certainly specific to the student and also specific to the environment and the activity.
And we had other people say things like crying and throwing and those things. Those are all forms of communication too, definitely. Yep. So I want to acknowledge that as well. All right, so just move along. So, you know, this is again not, you know, you have to, this is not necessarily going to be the function for any specific student, but I just wanted to kind of run through how your thinking might look. So we have interfering behavior, presumed function, and replacement. So one example might be we had the student who runs away from noise in our case study. They're escaping sensory stimulation, so the replacement behavior was to request headphones. I'm a big believer of teaching showing multiple examples so people kind of get the idea. So that's the purpose of this. Yeah. If a student throws a book, they try to escape an activity, so the teacher, instead of throwing a book, you just take a break. And that's a more skillful way of escaping that behavior activity. Running away from an adult, this was actually an example that we had in the community of practice last year in a meeting, the Autism Community of Practice. A parent put this together as an actual scenario where the student was running away from an adult on the playground, a para, but it was play-based. It was the way the student engaged in play, and I have totally seen that with some kids that I've worked with. And that's not always going to work when you're walking down the hallway right. Or if you're on a fire drill or different times. So you need to teach the student a more appropriate way to request that play. We talked about leading a teacher to an object. So they want, well, you know, I've seen students, they might lead it to a book or to a shelf where there's a preferred toy. So handing a picture, that's where that picture exchange communication system, PECS, and Ellen and I are doing a thing on that later in the year. Okay. I can't remember what month, but we have a PECS webinar coming up. But that is one, and there's some information on PECS. Do you want to describe that a little bit?
Well, I am a huge proponent of PECS, so I guess we'll see y'all then. But I love PECS. One thing I would say too is if what you're trying to get a student to do is to not lead, certainly picture exchange is a road you can go down. It's a little bit more, to go through PECS in a really purposeful way will take some time, but man, I would love to teach that kiddo to point. I would love to teach that kid that instead of taking my hand, point, and my eyes are going to go where your finger is pointing. So that idea, teaching a point, I think would be really exciting in that example.
Yes. And then the last example is, you know, a student who maybe uses a loud voice or screams. Maybe when a certain type of food is presented. We know a lot of students on the autism spectrum have very specific food preferences. And teaching a student to say no thank you. I mean, again, it's that teaching a more appropriate protest.
Yep, or teaching him even to take it off his tray. You know what, if you don't want it there, dude, take it off your tray, because that is going to be more useful to us than you screaming. So again, those replacement behaviors, depending on where that student is at as far as their own skill level, can be very basic, right? Push the tray toward me, but don't push it off the table. Those kinds of replacement behaviors make a lot of sense.
There's a good question. So what if the student requests multiple items, either by gesture or signing or using some type of voice output? How do we teach them to choose just one or one at a time?
So I think, I hate to say that I need more information, but I guess I would maybe need a little bit more information as far as when are we, is that kind of in a small group and he's asking for lots of different things, or I guess I need a little bit more information.
And I mean, it would depend. I mean, sometimes we have to ask ourselves, is it okay? I mean, you know, I mean, is it okay that a student asks for more than one thing? I mean, there's probably multiple answers for that. You know, visual schedules, choice boards. I mean, there's probably a few ways to go with that.
Yep, I think, and one thing that I think of too, and I don't know that this is kind of where you're coming from with this question, but it goes back a little bit that fare isn't equal. Sometimes I think we say, well, but the other kids, they only get to pick, you know, one kind of snack, and he asked for 3 or 4 different kinds of snacks. And that's when I say, well, what's our goal here? And if this is a kiddo who hasn't been doing any kind of spontaneously requesting in the past, and now he is, guess what? I'm going to say, okay, buddy, you can have 3 or 4 different snacks right now. And so I don't know that that's what you're getting at, but that's something that comes to mind.
And I would say you'll have sometimes peers will say, hey, that's no fair. But when the teacher says, well, this is what the student needs, you know, this is what's fair for the student. I mean, it's our attitudes definitely. The kids in schools where that's happening, it's more, I think, usually the adults with the concern than the students pretty quickly.
Yep, I think so too. And I do see your clarification. And maybe, I think that my email is on the end of this PowerPoint, and it might be, if you wanted to shoot me an email, I would be happy to kind of problem solve around that with you more specifically.
Sounds good.
Yep.
So when we're identifying a replacement behavior, we need to make sure that it's communicated in a way the student is able to perform. So, you know, if the student, if you know, in that example, in the case study, it was a student that could use verbal language. That they could have taught that student to say, I need my headphones right now. But because they knew that the headphones, that there was some difficulty with the student's communication and verbal communication, and knowing that the student was going under some stress and anxiety because of the noise level, we can't access difficult skills when we're stressed out. So make it easy. Give them something that's going to be, I would almost say, not only they can perform, but perform in the situation that they need to perform.
It has to be super easy. It has to be super easy. You know what's really easy and what works really well? Biting. Biting is a really effective form of communication. We all know what that means pretty quickly. So it has to be so easily accessed, so easy to do. Get a response right away, all those things. So I can't stress that enough because it's hard to compete with biting, frankly.
Yes. I mean, the goal is to make something as easy and as accessible with the communication. So that means it always has to be there too. So if you're going to teach a communication device, and that student doesn't have the communication device with them all day, that could be problematic.
Oh, it's problematic on so many levels.
So it is very important to make sure, and the idea is that eventually this new, easier piece, when it gets the same outcome, that's just going to become the default choice.
And you know, the other thing, we've talked a little bit about kind of when we're teaching students picture exchange communication systems, or we've got students who are learning how to use a speech generating device. This is maybe not the time to use those systems necessarily, because those systems are still hard and those systems are still new and the student isn't as familiar with them. So this might be a time where we say, gosh, you know what? He starts breaking all his pencils during math, so we're going to put a Big Mac switch on his desk, and he can just pound on that Big Mac switch. It's going to tell us he's all done, and he gets to go take a walk in the hall. So I would say kids do deserve functional communication systems. I want to put those systems in the hands of kids, but it doesn't mean that it's all or nothing. It doesn't mean that that's what you have to use to replace behaviors that are that are less skillful. So anyway.
No, it's great.
Good.
And we're going to continue to talk about this efficiency. It needs to be something that's pretty easy to teach the student, very accessible, and getting what's needed. So again, meeting that same function.
Yep.
And a big piece of this, the replacement behavior should be appropriate to the situation. I talk sometimes about age appropriate and developmentally appropriate. A really good example, I mean, this falls outside functional communication, but it's the way I categorize it. A game like Candyland, it may be developmentally appropriate for some people that are in high school, but it's not age appropriate. Regardless if other high schoolers think it might be fun to play that game, it's going to stigmatize that young adult. But Uno is developmentally appropriate for many students because all it is matching numbers and colors, and it's certainly age appropriate because little kids through adults play Uno. So when you find something, if you're working with middle and high school students, try to make sure it's something that looks age appropriate. And that's pretty easy to do. You can still make it easy and age appropriate. And make it realistic. So that means that is this going to be something that will be available to the student? Because if you have, you know, that the student is going, the replacement behavior is going to be something where they have to go to a specific room and that's the only place they can access it, but the behavior is happening in other places, that's just not going to work. It has to be something that's really going to work to meet the needs of what you're trying to do. A big piece of this goes with generalization, making sure that this is going to take us along the way to one of our further steps. But if you right off the bat make sure that whatever that replacement behavior is, other people are going to be able to recognize it, it's going to become a life skill. So, you know, there's nothing wrong with teaching students signs that maybe someone might not recognize. I use sign a lot with some students, but if you can teach it also gestures that are universal, that's going to help that student when they get on a bus or when they are dealing with someone with a substitute teacher. We really want to try to make the communication universal.
Yeah, and I would say I also have taught signs to a lot of my students, signs for break, signs for all done. It is not my default anymore, that I really am working to give students communication systems that are more universally accepted. So a speech generating device, which are so much easier now than they used to be for kids to have access to, as well as picture communication or a sentence strip or having them write something down, those are going to be my defaults much more than signs are at this point.
Definitely. Another piece of this, it should incorporate getting attention if needed. So what this means is if you are teaching a student to say a word that once they say it, it's gone, and that teacher is working with other students and didn't hear the student, that's going to be a problem, right? The student's going to learn that this isn't always getting me the same outcome, and they may go back to that easier way of getting that outcome. If you're teaching a student to show a picture or point, and the teacher's not looking at that student, they may have to go over and tug on the sleeve, touch the shoulder. What are some ways that you've taught getting attention?
Well, it's one of the reasons that I love PECS. So when we talk about picture exchange communication in a couple months, it is absolutely and without question one of the reasons I love PECS so much, because that idea of that picture exchange where a student takes a picture and literally puts it in the hand of a communicative partner means that there's an attention-getting kind of component to that. So I see way too often students given speech-generating devices, they sit on the desk, the student is pushing more, and no one is acknowledging that the student is asking for more, you know, and then they get upset. Well, of course they do, because no one is paying attention to them. They don't have, as skillful as that is, pushing more, they don't have the skill set to kind of wave their arms or say, hey, teacher, I'm saying this, or raise the volume, all those things that typically developing kids might do to kind of get attention and to get their message understood. So that idea of it is one of the reasons I really love picture exchange. And I'm not sure that we've talked about this in this particular PowerPoint, but the other piece around doing FCT well, I think, is to train or at least to talk to the communicative partners. So talking to the gen ed teacher and saying like, hey, listen, when she does this, we need you to let her take a break. When he does this, that means that he needs his like fidget toys, those kinds of things. So that idea of giving a heads up to everybody, this is what we're working on, this is what the student's going to be doing, and this is what we need you to do is an important component.
So I'm curious, and I know the answer to this, and I told you I was going to set you up with this question.
Oh gosh.
Okay. Have you ever talked to another adult and said, okay, when this student hands you the break card, you're going to let them go over into that corner and select an item to use for 5 minutes? And they say, so the student's just getting out of the work? How do you, I mean, that is a question that comes up when I do presentations. How do you respond to that?
Yes, certainly. And I think it's kind of a default reaction we all have. Like, well, gosh, but they've got to do their math. They have to do their math. And I get it. I totally get it. And so what we say, though, is let's say we've got a student. You give him his math worksheet. We've already kind of shortened what's there. We've told him he only has to do every other one. We've cut it into strips and shortened it. And he still sometimes breaks those pencils, throws the pencils down, and refuses to do the work. And so we all do an FBA, and we realize that, no surprise to anyone, that that's kind of an escape behavior. He doesn't want to do the math. So we're going to teach that student the ability to be able to ask for a break so that he can, in fact, take a break from the math. That is a totally reasonable thing, because what I try to tell folks is, yeah, but, so they say, but he's got to do the math. He's got to do the math. And I say, is he doing the math? Because I don't think he's doing the math. I think he's breaking the pencils and throwing it on the ground and disrupting the whole class and getting everyone all worked up. So he's not doing the math. It's when we need to kind of prioritize and say, what are our priorities right now, so that we can get him to do the math. And there's lots of other pieces. Is the math appropriate? Is it differentiated? All those pieces need to be in place. But it is okay to give students away, because if you ask me, communication trumps all. We need to be able to teach kids to communicate in a skillful way. So, so yes, and you know what else he's going to do is he's going to ask for a break, and then he's going to ask for another. He's going to ask for a lot of breaks because he's a smart kid, right? He doesn't want to do math, so he's going to take his 5-minute break. He's going to sit back down. He's going to hand that picture asking for a break again, and he's going to ask potentially for multiple breaks, too many breaks. He's not doing math. We'll get there. We will get there. But to teach the communication, we need to say, oh, great job, buddy. You gave me that red X. That means you want a break. Go take a break. Go take a break. You know what? In a week or 2 weeks or 3 weeks down the road, we're going to say, you know what? You only get 3 X's. There are ways you can do this to fade it back, and we'll talk about that.
When you get the kind of the behavior more skillful, it gives you a chance to take a step back and address what is it about the math that's difficult, and gives you time to then kind of relook at that piece. And I totally go with what you say about what is the student doing already. They're doing the same, they're getting just as, but it's less skillful. And we got to think long term. We're talking life outcomes. I showed a video this morning, I did a presentation of a young man who's finishing college at UW-Milwaukee. I had some videos I did for a project. He's talking about life in college. He has Asperger's. After the presentation, a woman walks up, was his neighbor, and said, I remember in 6th grade, he was running over to a wall in gym class and slamming his fists and screaming. And this student talked about how he had a lot of difficulties in schools and a lot of frustration and anger. And here he is graduating UW-Milwaukee. I mean, an unbelievable story. And it's just fantastic to hear. We don't sometimes think of the big picture of where we're trying to go with the student. We think, what do we have to do today, and not thinking about the long term.
And I think some of that really, and this is just kind of in deference to you teachers that are in the classroom, I think some of that is the climate right now. I get it. It's hard. It's hard to say we are going to put academics on the back burner for a little bit. It is very challenging. I do not always think you are getting support for that message. However, I do think it's our job to kind of stand up for kids and to say this is what needs to happen for this kid now so that we can get to the academics.
And we are talking about situations where the student already is not engaged in the work. And here's an evidence-based approach that teaches us how to get us jump-started. Another quick analogy with that, you can think of that behavior of breaking the pencils or screaming or crying or running away or hitting or biting. That's basement behavior. And that break card is not the penthouse. That's not the most skillful behavior the student is going to learn. This is not our goal. This is getting us to the first floor. This is getting us out of the basement. So that's another analogy that Terry Derry shared with me that I use to describe that. So, you know, think of that really difficult, challenging behavior as basement behavior, and talk to your teachers. We want to get to the first floor, and then once we get it under control, let's try to figure out how to make things even better. All right, so data collection is step 4. It needs to be functional, meaningful, and available to all staff. You know, I'm going to show you really quick a data collection sheet, and maybe, Ellen, you can walk us through this, kind of what this looks like a little bit.
Yep, I think, so this is going back a little bit to some of that information that we gathered during the FBA, or the Functional Behavior Assessment. That idea of the antecedent and the consequence. So what happened immediately before we saw this behavior and what happened immediately after. So this sheet is just an example. It reminds everybody what was that behavior that we were kind of having some trouble with again, and it was that the student was running from the room. So I think it's important to put it there. What are we talking about again? And then what are we trying to teach? We're going to try and teach the student to sign for break. And so, you know, some basic things. So we were on July 30th. We were in the resource room. The student was doing, what was the antecedent? They were doing math flashcards. Now this is, what did we see? Did we see the student engage in the interfering behavior, or did we see the student use the replacement behavior? And in this case, they used the interfering behavior, and you'll see nothing is circled or highlighted, no prompts. And so it says the consequence was that he did avoid the task. He ran out of the room, and he wasn't doing math flashcards for that moment. And then on the notes, the staff person had written, I was on the phone, I missed some of those early indicators, things that we look for before he runs. So then later that day, they were in the classroom, they were doing independent reading, the student engaged in the replacement behavior, and the staff person said that they verbally prompted. So they must have said, like, you can ask for a break, and the break was provided. Yeah. And then the same thing happened later in the day. One thing that I was just talking with a team last week where they're dealing with a student who's engaging in lots of different kind of behaviors that are quite challenging. Aggressive behaviors, challenging. And so they're looking at collecting some data around it. And what I suggested was instead of having a staff person write down what was the antecedent and what was the consequence, I said, why don't you offer a bunch of multiple choice options, things that you know might be happening. So like it might be that you know that a paraprofessional sometimes after a student, say, throws everything off his desk, then takes him for a walk, which works and also might be something that that student really likes. And so it's those kind of things that sometimes if somebody has to self-report, it can be hard because when you go back to self-report, you think, oh, crud, that probably wasn't the best idea then. And so it's hard to do it. But sometimes offering kind of a checklist of this is what I did, takes some of the judgment off, and it's easier for folks to report it.
So you're talking about that consequences. Again, yep. I like to think of that term as outcomes.
Yep.
Because when we think consequence, it was like, how was the student punished? But really, we're talking about what was the outcome mm-hmm. of that situation.
Yep.
What happened to the student? What happened to the adults? Sometimes we think about what do students say and do? What do the adults say and do? What do the peers right. say and do?
Yep.
And then I like that, so you can kind of give some choices, mm-hmm. and it makes it a lot faster than data collection
yep.
can be really tricky. Yep. One thing with data collection, don't set up a procedure that no one's going to end up taking the data. Yep. Then it's useless. You have to make it easy for staff to quickly just check off a couple things, mm-hmm. Make it accessible, make it confidential, still being respecting the yep. student. But you just have to really come up with your team. It's going to look different for yep. every team.
That's right. And I also think, especially when we're talking about certain behaviors and when there needs to be certain consequences, you also are legally obligated to take some pretty high-quality data around that. And so keep that in mind, too. It's different if we're just kind of talking about how we can turn a leading into a point. But if we're talking about students who are engaging in behaviors that are concerning or might interfere with the safety of themselves or others, then you yeah. need to be conscious on the data collection procedures you're using.
It's very important to take data yeah. and to share that data as well with families and with all the people involved, yeah. and when appropriate with the student too. Yeah. The IPGV, so you want to walk us through that?
Oh, sorry, yeah, I'm sorry. That's just under, like, what prompts did we provide? And I think we're going to talk a little bit about kind of what prompting we provide to students, but I think there's, I think it's like cut, yeah, independent, physical prompt, a gesture prompt, a verbal prompt. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And one of these might be, it might have been, I'm not sure, but like sometimes if it's a picture, holding up a picture, it could be a visual prompt. Yeah, that could be visual.
Yeah, right. Probably, actually.
So you want to be clear on what the data collection is mm-hmm. telling us too. So teach replacement behavior in the setting where the interfering behavior occurs. So what does that mean? Why do we need to be thinking about teaching this where those behaviors are naturally occurring anyway. Why not just go into a room that's a little, if it's happening in the lunchroom, why not teach this, or can you,
in
another room? Yeah, in your speech room or in another room. Why are we looking at trying to do this in the setting where these things are happening?
And that's a little bit when we, I think this is true for all kids, but we know it is true for students with autism, because the neurology of autism means that these students will have trouble generalizing across environments. So that means exactly that. I can teach lots of wonderful things in my speech room. We are one-on-one, it's quiet, I have it set up. I can teach lots of great, wonderful things there, and I have had no success having students then use those same strategies in a general education classroom, in a cafeteria, in the hallway, all those places. So we know this of students on the spectrum. They have a trouble generalizing across environments, so you have to teach it where it happens.
Great. Another piece of this is setting up the situation where the replacement behavior can be taught. So a piece of this is, and I'll give a quick example, like if you're, I'm thinking of just even teaching some basic communication. When I was teaching students that were just learning basic communicative attempts with partners, teaching a student, for example, help me. We would take bubbles. This is like the classic one, right? And you take the lid and tighten it on there so the student could not get it off by themselves. And you taught the student, not to the point of frustration and crying, but you taught the student that when they said help me, you unscrewed the lid. And then they got to play with the bubbles and they blew them, and then you put the bubbles away, you did something else, and then you put the bubbles out again and tighten that lid. And very quickly you were setting up situations, and we did this in our naturalistic interventions, you're setting up situations where the student is going to need to request that, use that replacement behavior.
And that's tricky. I mean, that can be tricky, but as many opportunities as a student has to practice a new skill, the better they're going to be with that new skill. And so you have to kind of do that carefully and set up situations. And then we're going to talk a little bit about prompting. You are going to provide as much prompting as that child needs so that they're successful. You're absolutely going to make that happen. So yeah, I think practice is important.
And it's going to look different. If you take our case study with the student and the headphones in the gym, you know, it may be hard to like schedule. I mean, it's possible. You could have the student come into the gym a couple extra periods just to practice that skill and request that if you wanted to. For some students, you would not have to do that. They might get it right away. This is much easier and better. But for a student, especially some of those behaviors where they're biting, you know, the more probably self-injurious or injurious to other people behavior, the more you really want to make sure you're practicing that replacement behavior and immediately providing that student with the outcome that the student is requesting.
Absolutely.
So, you know, you may have to do this. Just keep in mind that you have to have those materials available. If you are going to have a picture of headphones, you better have those pictures of headphones available when and where they're needed. You need to make sure that your staff understands that when this break card or this general ed teacher, when that student hands a break card, they get the break. You have to be prepared to stop an activity. Short of fire alarms and drills and emergency situations, you have to respect that communicative attempt. And if there's things that they're asking access to, they have to be there too. So it does take some planning and thought, for sure.
Yep, absolutely.
So with these generalization, and how do you describe generalization if people are not familiar with that term? Just really quick. We've used it a couple times.
Yep. So we've all seen this, and it's true of lots of us, that we teach or a student gets used to doing something in one place, and then they go and try and do it another place, and they're not as successful. So kind of the tried and true example is that idea when you maybe have a home-based provider who's doing kind of discrete trial training on greeting or on labeling, and then that student is asked to do the same thing in their preschool circle time, and you don't see that student able to able to do that same skill in a different setting. But exactly some of the things we were talking about, students who can do one thing, gosh, they always do, they always can read through 3 pages out loud with me in the resource room, but when we ask them to do that in the gen ed classroom with their paraprofessional, they're not as successful. Those kinds of things we see a lot. So, or they'll do it with me and they won't do it with anybody else. You hear that a ton. We need to be teaching students in multiple environments, and we need to be having them work with multiple people.
Great. So this is another chance for you to just digest this a little bit. So think about a student, think about a communication that you're looking at making more skillful. Who would you want your student or child to be able to communicate with? Who all in your environment? So if you're going along this process and thinking of some ideas, go ahead and jot those down. You can type them in. We'll take a quick break for just about 30, 45 seconds. And what settings would you want to practice the new skill? So we'll be back in about 30 seconds. All right, so we had some great ideas here. I'm gonna reply all to a few of these, and I'll just kind of do that as we kind of move along here. So let's talk about prompting, and this is something. There is a MPDC ASD. There is a module on prompting that is extensive. I have actually not done a specific prompting training because I don't know. I think it's hard to discuss, but I don't know if you want to kind of get us on the right track. What is prompting?
To be honest, I think when we're talking about prompting with functional communication training, it's a very different message than I find myself giving most of the time. So most of the time when I'm talking with teams, I am talking about we need to use least to most prompting, that we can't be over prompting our kids, right? We can't say, oh, it's time for circle in the early childhood classroom and pick that student up and carry them over to circle time, which happens a lot. And so we can't be over prompting. We need to push kids to give them as little help as they need to be independent. So that's usually what I'm saying, that we are going to err on the side of a less restrictive prompt, of like a point or a gesture or a picture, rather than providing, say, a full physical prompt, like taking their hand and leading them over to circle time. When we're talking about functional communication training, though, the game changes, because what we need to happen is for that student to not engage in that original behavior at all. So we need that student to not, because here's the thing, if they run out of the gym, they're going to still get that same outcome. It's successful. They run out of the gym and all of a sudden the sound is less. So it just reinforces that pattern. They're like, oh, hey, yeah, that did work. So we are going to do everything in our power to have them use the new replacement behavior. So that might mean using hand over hand. So with that kiddo in the cafeteria, it might be that when we first introduce it, we stand behind him and we take his hand in ours and help him peel that picture off and hand it over to somebody. A full physical prompt so that he's successful. So that's what we're talking about, errorless learning. And we obviously need to do that in a way that doesn't cross boundaries of seclusion and restraint and all of that. Certainly not holding students down and picking them up and all of that. But it does mean providing more rather than less prompting to ensure success.
And I'll throw in here another idea is video modeling. So if you can do a video of the peer who's maybe prompted from behind one time and they can watch that video, I've heard people with great success with that, or it could be what could be the student or a peer that's wearing similar clothing. So there's ways, but definitely it's making sure that that is happening.
Yeah.
And if you want to learn a little bit, I know I was definitely trained in this from my background, but those physical prompts, fading them out as quickly as you can, and there's ways, and there's some modules on the A module that discuss that and how to do that. But the goal is that this is what's needed right away, and then pretty quickly. I mean, most students, and again, presumed competence. I have done this with the most significant students. They understand that, okay, you take this picture and I hand it to you, and this is the outcome.
Yep.
It's very powerful. It's very powerful.
Yep, you gotta pick the right replacement. You have to know the function, pick an easy replacement behavior, and respond to it consistently, and it'll typically work.
Here's a couple of ideas I kind of just threw together for different types. You know, certainly you can use a verbal prompt. You know, some verbal prompts. What about those open-ended ones like, what do you want? What do you need? Are those appropriate at times?
I think so. You know, I mean, again, those are things as far as how my own practice, I think, has changed and evolved, that for students on the spectrum, I am pulling out those kind of verbal prompts as I don't tend to go to them. I think I do tend to write it. I might write that on a whiteboard and put it in front of them. You know, what is it you want? Or tell us what you want, or ask for a break. I might do that instead because, again, what we're learning about students on the spectrum is that those verbal prompts can be very, very hard to pull out of the routine. So, so certainly we all still use them. Of course we do, but they tend to not be my go-to.
Which of these do you think is the easiest to fade out, or which ones? So when we say fade out, that means you start with it being very obvious that you are cueing the student in some way, and eventually they're being much more independent without needing the cue to engage in that.
So I guess I would say that I don't think that visual prompts always need to be faded out.
Yeah.
So that's my
answer.
piece.
I love it.
That's my piece,
that
is that oftentimes we'll give kids visual prompts, like we'll put a picture on their desk, or we'll give them a checklist, or, you know, I mean, who knows? I mean, you know, that there's a rubber band around their wrist reminding them of something, and my take is many times those visual prompts simply don't need to be removed, and that those are tools that we all use.
Yes, we all use visual prompts. I actually have a slide later on. One of the questions about fading is, do we need to?
Right, absolutely.
Because I was actually taught a ways back that you always try to fade out independence, but we all use visual supports in some way. I mean, please. All right. So here's the links to the AIM modules and MPDC. If you want to learn more about prompting, definitely I would recommend taking a look at those modules on AIM.
I would. They're not. They are not great. I will tell you this right now. They're good. They're good information. They are not my favorite for classroom-based interventions. So I also
think. Do you know
think,
of a good prompting
resource?
Know what?
I think if you look into the idea of how do you develop a prompting hierarchy, and you have that conversation with your team, and you say, what are we going to do first? And then if that doesn't work, what are we going to do next? And if that doesn't work, what are we going to do next? That's what I have seen be most successful, to bring your parents together and say, we're going to really develop this so that we're all using the same prompts for this student in this way. I think that's what I've seen to be most helpful.
Great. So with next step 8 and 9, it's reinforcing replacement behavior and minimizing reinforcement of interfering behavior. The reinforcement piece here, I mean, basically what we're saying is when that student uses the replacement behavior, you immediately and consistently get them what they are communicating. If they're communicating to get away from something, they get away from it. If they're communicating access to something, they get it, not after 15 more minutes, not after finishing this math sheet.
Right.
And I will say, I mean, I guess it depends on the student, because maybe that's appropriate for some students a certain along the way. But if it's a big deal.
Not right away. Yeah. Not right away.
Yeah, not right away. Yes, exactly. So, I mean, you really have to, and that's with the error list too. You can always in the future, that's going to be a further step.
Absolutely.
Along the way is looking at that wait time. But when you are teaching, it's every time and right away.
Yep, that's right. Every time and right away, and everybody. And so even if there's a certain staff member who doesn't want to give that student a gummy bear every time they ask for a gummy bear, like, it's non-negotiable. That's the phrase I'm starting to use more and more, right? We talk with our teams and we say, this thing we're teaching right now, this thing we're doing right now is non-negotiable. If they do this, they get this right away. And again, like Daniel said, we're going to talk about how that changes across time, but at first, every time and right away.
We're getting out of the basement.
Yep, absolutely, yep.
And remember to, you know, and with this, you know, it's making that attempt at the targeted skill. So what if that student doesn't actually pick up the picture of the headphones and hand it to you, but just touches it or flicks it on the desk? Why is it still important to go ahead and immediately provide that reinforcement and give them those headphones?
Well, I think a couple things. So I think that idea of certainly reinforcing if an attempt is made, but I think I also go back to that idea of errorless learning, so that if a student is just kind of flicking at the card and we think this is still reasonable for that student to pick the card up and hand it over, I would be doing prompting to get that student to do that action more completely, or looking at potentially a different replacement behavior. But that idea of shaping it too is something you can look at. That idea of taking a little bit, and if a baby says "ba" and we know it's the bottle, that kind of shaping.
And if you're providing a verbal prompt, I mean, you're not going to sit there and say it 30 times when you know the student. When your functional behavior assessment says, you know what, I'm seeing the precursors to something that's going to happen that we're trying to teach more skillfully, and you might say, what do you want? What do you want? And at some point, you have to just provide it before there's a complete meltdown. Am I all right?
Yeah.
And we had a nice
question.
So we had a good question here, and I'll read this question. So at school, if a student wants a teacher who's not available, and I have heard that question before, there are students who want a specific person right away. What is the replacement behavior? That's a good one.
Yep, and so then the follow-up is that you are seeing some aggressive behaviors that you hit and grab the teacher to get the attention. This isn't going to be a popular answer, because what I'm going to say is we need to teach that student a way that they get that teacher's attention. We are going to pull back from that soon. But at the beginning, if we are in a situation where we are putting a student in a restraint, potentially, frequently because of these behaviors.
Because of aggressive
behaviors, this is a big deal. This is a big deal, and it requires a big response. So we are going to teach that student how they can get that teacher's attention, which means working with the whole team. So that teacher is going to then be working with the other staff, like, when I need to go, I got to go, and this is what you're going to do. So that's the immediate, that we're going to teach that student a way to get that teacher's attention, because that's what they're asking for. In the meantime, we are going to be doing lots of other things to get that student more accepting of other folks. We are going to be doing some video models. We are going to be writing social stories. We are going to be
using visual timers.
Right, exactly.
Putting the person in a schedule so that they will get to see them at these times of day.
So there's lots of other pieces, and eventually that student is going to engage. We're going to say, instead of hitting and kicking, we're going to have you push on the Big Mac switch, and it's going to say, I want teacher, and that teacher is going to come over. Later, not yet, later, they're going to put, I want teacher, and someone is going to set a visual timer, and they know that when that visual timer is up, then they'll get the teacher. But at first, and it is hard, at first, we've got to get them what they want.
We have to build that initial skillful behavior. And then we build upon that. You have to have a starting point. And I think that the sell is that if you have a behavior that is getting the student and staff injuring themselves, others, teachers do not enjoy that. No. Parents don't, the child doesn't, the administration, I mean, everyone, that's when we use those measures. That's why we have to do it. And we know that in the long term, we can move beyond that. But that is the first step, and it is a hard answer sometimes. Yeah,
it's the first step, and it's not the only thing. All that other stuff is happening at the same time.
You have, this is not an isolated, when you have that type of behavior, you should be thinking of multiple interventions. Visual support, schedules, social narratives. There's many. Look at the evidence-based practice checklist or the different modules, and you'll get a lot of ideas.
Yep, and again, we know such little bits of information, right? Are there ways that student can earn lunch with that teacher? That those kinds of things that can be built in, all of that goes on top of this. But as far as functional communication training goes, you teach a replacement behavior and they get her attention. So.
And we've already touched on this, actually, shaping the communicative response and fading prompts. So this is where, Ellen was talking about, you may have to really teach that student, be completely errorless, and make sure that they are communicating. If that's a handover, if that's that student taking their hand, picking up the picture, and handing it to somebody. But then, eventually you want to kind of fade that piece out so that they can be a little more independent. And as we said, there are some things you may not fade out, like visual supports. Next piece here. And this is just an example of a shaping technique. So, if, we talked about the other idea of kind of the prompting piece of that, but it could look like the student touching the break card, they get the break. Then you move up to, teaching that student to pick up the break card, handing the break card. And I almost think of it, eventually you want that student to be able to maybe pick something up, walk across the room, and wait a few seconds and hand it to someone when they have their attention.
Yep.
But that's kind of a gradual progression there.
Absolutely.
And remember, the response needs to be easy, efficient, and realistic for the student to use independently. All right. With fading, talk to us a little bit about how people might use, now this is after, we should note, this is not in one day, right?
No.
You're not at step 10 and 11 on the first day.
Unless you're very good. No.
So this is after the student is using the replacement behavior often.
Yep.
And you feel confident. What is modified time delay? What does that look like?
I mean, modified time delay, I giggle a little bit because the language is so fancy, when really I think sometimes all of us learned it as pause time, or just kind of giving that space to let a student do something more independently. And I think many of us know what I mean when I say that expectant look. Your eyebrows are up, like your hands are open. What are you going to do? What do you need? That kind of piece. So starting to kind of fade those prompts in that way. And then I'm kind of going, well, I guess I'm stepping ahead, but I think that, and then that does change when you say some of these visual supports that we're putting in place, we are going to let that student keep. But maybe it's a situation where you've been writing on a dry erase board, make a choice, and you've been handing that to the students. Maybe it becomes that there's just a note on that student's desk all the time that says make a choice, so that they're having to remember to access that cue rather than it being handed to them, those kinds of pieces, or it's there to kind of remind them all day instead of just specifically in the moment. So some of those are ideas on fading.
And then we're looking at increasing that time between the replacement behavior and reinforcement. Again, this is down the line. This is where we start to, as we had that previous discussion, someone's asking for a certain type of adult, we might have to make that adult available, but that is not the end goal. That's when you introduce some other interventions that the functional behavior assessment or the team and the family and everyone thinks might be effective, and you build up that ability for that student to have some time between that request and what happens. And
and that's, I think it's good to tell teachers that when they say, well, what do you mean if they ask for a break, they get a break? We say that, again, just like Daniel was saying, that's not the end goal. We really are eventually going to teach that, well, first you've got to do 3 math problems, or, you know what, I'm going to set the timer for 5 minutes. Or, you know what, buddy, I'm writing your name on this sticky note and I'm putting it on my desk because when the bell rings, I'm all yours. Those kinds of messages, those are the kinds of things we're going to be teaching kids to do. But that comes once they learn that most skillful behavior. And where it says here, use caution when increasing the time between, the reason we want to say use caution is that we still want to have errorless teaching. We do not want that student to go back to that primary behavior, to go back to that behavior that was less skillful, because it's going to be successful, because it worked, and it will work again. Biting will work again. Fleeing the room will work again. Toppling the table will work again, because they work. And so, so that's why we still want to make sure it's errorless learning. Don't go too far too fast.
Yeah, we want to build a bridge and not a cliff.
Yep.
Yeah, good. The next step here is monitoring learning progress, data collection. Are they using that replacement behavior? What level of prompting are we using? How is the student starting to learn to do this more independently? Again, there may be some visual prompts that the student will always be required, will always be supporting students. And it's just, to me, it's almost more adapting those prompts to be more age appropriate as the student grows up.
Absolutely.
So what something looks like that a child needs in kindergarten is going to look different in high school. And maybe into adult life. And making sure there's good training there. Really quick, just on data, it's a great tool to have conversations with families. And especially if those of you who are listening do have those behaviors where students, I mean, they are either self-interest to the student or to others. Certainly being able to have some data and say, this is what we're doing, this is how consistently we're doing it, these are all the people involved, here's what we're seeing, it really takes it away from being more personal. So data can be, it's such a great tool to talk with families with, in my experience. In addition, we need to not only be looking at the student, but let's also go back to those implementation checklists and just make sure we're not missing a step. Make sure that maybe we need to go back to the FBA or bring in a new set of eyes, or bring in, if you didn't talk with the family in the process, or maybe you found a really good interview form online or the district uses, or you went to a conference and you saw a new tool to get a new piece of information that you're like, hey, let's try that and let's see if that helps us figure out what's going on. So as we wrap up, key ideas here. And Ellen, you reminded me of this, the FBA is critical. Having the correct FBA, knowing why the behavior is occurring is critical.
If you don't have the right function, it will not work. Because you'll teach a replacement behavior that's not replacing anything. So you have to have the right function.
Yep. It means it has to have the same outcome.
Yep.
And we need to talk about what we're teaching. And there's that generalization. Doing this across adults is very important. And then this other piece of immediately reinforcing the replacement behavior. And when we say reinforce, there was a term you were using, like it's acknowledging the student's communication.
I think I used the phrase honor the communication, which is, it depends on your camp if you like that phrase, but it's true. So, that student has communicated in a way, and we're going to honor it. We're going to say, you asked for a break, you get a break. You asked for gummy bear, you get a gummy bear. You know what I mean? You asked to jump on the trampoline, we're going to go jump on the trampoline. You asked to leave math, you get to leave math. All those things, whatever it is you've asked for, you get. And so every time and right away. At first, we'll get there, but every time and right away.
A couple things with just kind of making things more handy. Teachers are very creative, and I've seen the lanyards with pictures, using dry erase boards. I mean, there's so many creative ways, especially with technology now, to help with helping teach some of these skills. I think that at times when you're skillful at doing this, really trying to sit in the student's perspective and thinking about this student and where they're at and what are their wants, what are their needs, what is motivating that student, trying to just really figure out from the student's perspective, does this make sense? Like a good example is handwriting. We have a lot of students on the autism spectrum that really have adverse reactions to handwriting, and there's a lot of information that tells us because of this processing difficulty, handwriting is extremely hard to access all the skills in handwriting. Because in writing in general, like open, free-form, creative writing especially. But, for example, if the student knows that doing a writing assignment will then be given to the principal who will read it on the intercom, and that's something the student really likes, their view of writing may have totally changed. Or if the student is able to write about their interests, that could totally change their perspective of the activity. So there's a lot of pieces to that to consider to make things more engaging for students.
More engaging, more realistic, more manageable, all of that, right? And so I think we touched on that a little bit before. If a student is engaged, if that student is breaking his pencils and throwing them down and ripping up the paper in math class, we need to look at that behavior that the student is engaging in, and we also need to look at our own teaching behaviors and what are we asking that student to do, and are there things that we can do to make it more manageable. It's two-sided there. We can't get mad at a kid for ripping up a math assignment that is beyond them, that is too much, that is not that is not differentiated in an appropriate way, all those things.
And we know the strong link between academic difficulties with behavior difficulties. Yep. They go hand in hand, so you need to work on both of those together.
Yep.
That's why our RTI Center, the PBIS is it's the behavior piece of response to intervention.
Absolutely.
So if this is not working, if functional communication is not training is not being effective, if you're saying, oh, we tried that, we're having difficulties, I just came up with a couple things just to consider. Big one, did the communication you are teaching serve as a replacement behavior? Does the child get the same outcome every time? Ask that question. Sometimes turning things into a question to your team can help you say, have a conversation about it. Is the replacement behavior efficient, appropriate, and recognizable to others? So is that student just pushing a button, but the teacher, maybe can't attend to it right away, or is out of earshot of the communication or something like that? Is the instruction provided in the setting where the interfering behavior occurs? So that's that, getting back to that piece. Talking about prompting procedures, what's appropriate for that learning. A verbal prompt may not be the best idea. There could be something that might be more effective. Doing something that's going to increase the probability of that replacement behavior happening. A prompt that's going to match up well with the student. Immediate reinforcement, and making sure, again, I'm kind of repeating myself, that the reinforcement provides the same outcome as interfering behavior. Hopefully that's a big takeaway from this one. And that's why it's called functional communication training, right? Because it's functional. It's the function. It's why is this happening. Yep. I would recommend including families in the discussion of replacement communication so that you have some consistency between home and school. Educators can help families set up environments. So where are we going to look at this in the home setting, and what are we going to do, and how are we going to do that? That can be very, very helpful for families at times. And definitely there's great functional communication behavior assessments. There's questionnaires that you can find. Your district may have some. You can look online. You can talk to people. I have some samples if you ever need them.
Again, a high-quality FBA will always include you talking with the family. That is part of the process. Yep.
I have a couple just quick slides. This is for more your reference. There's some parent training organizations in Wisconsin that are great, that help families with all kinds of communications and finding resources. So it's always good to pass along information to families about some of those groups. I will tell you, as kind of a wrap-up, let's keep in mind that this is an evidence-based practice. This is part of what we are doing here in Wisconsin. If you look at our guiding principles for teaching and learning, making sure that we have purposeful assessment, a functional behavior assessment is definitely a piece of that. That collaborative responsibility, looking at those student strengths, being responsive to learners. Some of you are probably starting to be familiar with educator effectiveness, and those of you that are in districts using the Danielson framework, those domains of planning and preparation, classroom environment, instruction, and professional responsibility. If you look at some of the pieces to that, definitely knowledge of functional communication training kind of has pieces of those frameworks. These could be look-fors for some of the things that you may be asked to do as part of that educator effectiveness program. That's going to be very district specific, but it's something to talk about with your district administrators.
I recommend to folks all the time. I'm not sure with Danielson what you call them, but if you have to upload some kind of artifact, if you have to present something that shows work that you've been doing, those implementation checklists that Daniel was talking about are perfect to show kind of your own professional growth across time. Perfect.
So I'm kind of just flipping through, some of the pieces to that, and I just think that, when we're using good, strong, evidence-based practices, that fits in. And I would say certainly if you have a school that's doing positive behavior intervention supports in response to intervention, the PBIS piece of this, functional communication training, I can see how that could fit into a very specific, functional piece there. I don't think I put in my slides this time on universal design, but boy, I bet a lot of you can be thinking about all kinds of students who may not even have special education needs, where you can use some of these functional communication training pieces. I think good parents do that with their kids all the time, probably, like teaching them, here's another way to ask for this, or to do a certain skill. The AIM and MPDC resources are there. I found a couple of links online. Please make sure to fill out a webinar survey. I want to just note, quick plug, we have a 2-day autism training that's going to be brand new coming up and it's going to be Judy Endow and Kate McGinnity in June, and it's changing behavior by supporting autistic thinking styles. So Judy Endow, who has autism, and Kate McGinnity are working on kind of new conceptions, very visual-oriented training, visual sports-oriented, and I'm really looking forward to kind of some new frameworks and perspectives and tools that they're going to bring out of that training. It'll be up on the DPI website. It's not available for registration yet, but it will be soon. And then just with our webinars, we mentioned PECS. We are doing PECS, it looks like April 3rd, but I have some other great webinars coming up as well throughout this year. I'm going to add one more with Mary McMullen, too, that we want to do one around early childhood. So we're going to select a date for that probably in May or June as well. Let's take a look at a couple questions that have come up.
Yep, there was one that came in saying, what is an appropriate reteaching strategy when a student is verbally defiant when given a directive and throws tantrums with a goal of attention? And I hate to kind of always defaulting and saying that we don't know the situation, that we need more information, but my first question would be, are those potentially two different behaviors with two different functions? So the idea of maybe being verbally defiant is potentially, if you collect the data, does it end up meaning that they escape kind of and don't have to kind of follow through on what you've done? And the tantruming, is it a situation where when the student throws a tantrum, they're taken into the resource room where they're provided more one-on-one attention? So these are just examples I'm giving. So sometimes a student can be engaging in different behaviors across their day that are serving different functions, and then you're going to need to teach different replacement behaviors in that way. But again, when I hear words like defiant, and I'm not questioning, students can be defiant and they can be oppositional. I get it, and I am not saying it's easy, but sometimes those words also to me indicate that teachers are at a point where they're just frustrated, like they just won't do it. And again, if what you think this student needs is that we need to go through functional communication training, if that student's if that verbal refusal that they're engaging in is to escape the task, we're going to give them another way to escape the task in a more polite way. So again, it's not always the answer we want, but if we can take that deep breath and say we are bringing it to a more skillful level, getting it out of the basement, like Daniel said, that can make more sense. But I do think clearly looking at behaviors, and also here's the other thing that can be tricky that we haven't even talked about. Sometimes behaviors can serve multiple functions. So sometimes a student, let's say, can bite, and they're biting a peer because they don't really know how to say, can I play with you? And so they're reaching over and biting. And then other times they're biting when you're trying to work with them on toileting because they really have no interest in being in the bathroom. So that same behavior of biting is both a request for kind of attention, a request for play, as well as a protest of an activity. So it's tricky, but that can absolutely happen.
Yeah, and again, I think it is a paradigm shift that some people have, it's hard to go through in thinking that we're going to start by just letting the student, they're getting out of it in a sense, but they already, here's the thing again, they're already getting out of it. It's already happening. So you're not going to make anything worse. And you're beginning building blocks, and just remember, it's not the only thing. You're going to have additional thoughts on how to either change what the demands are, how they're given, or what the task is, or how to increase the motivation for that task to make it more in line with the student's interests, to make the materials more attractive, to make those things. And I think that sometimes we think about these things, but again, once we have that momentum and that student is engaged and involved, you start to see the flexibility. That's when you start teaching the flexibility and going, yeah, I know, oh, that's too bad, we have to do this now. Right. Oh, man, I understand, but let's get through this, and then we're going to, talk about it later. We're going to do this other thing afterwards, And developmentally, it depends on the student. We have to remember that adults aren't very good at being very patient at times and having things go the way they want. And so oftentimes we're talking about 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12-year-old kids.
Well, a couple things. And I think it's Laura had another question, and I do want to reference that. But I had a colleague once tell me, and I bring this up all the time, that school is the one time we ask people to be good at everything. You know, as adults, we're not really asked to do that. But when kids are at school, we say you're supposed to be good at math. You're supposed to be good at working in a group. You need to be good working by yourself. You need to be good in physical activity, and you need to be good at music, and you need to be good at everything. And it's tricky. No wonder they're stressed, right? No wonder it's hard. And so I think keeping that in mind, I think, is a good thing. And then the question came up, do you have suggestions for students with multiple diagnoses? So the idea of oppositional defiant disorder or mood disorders and autism. And I think without question, comorbid kind of diagnoses complicate it. And so what I would say is we need to always kind of consider that neurology of autism as an overlay, but that doesn't mean that we don't look to other methods and methodologies to try to see if that might work for an individual student if they're dealing with other issues. And the other conversation that I've been having with a lot of teams lately is also to know your limits. I think I've got lots of teams who are saying, well, but you know, what do we do about this OCD, or what do we do about this other kind of, when it's crossing more into kind of mental health arenas. And I am telling those teams sometimes the best thing you can do is to say to a family, is to say to administration, this is out of my scope, and I need help, and I don't know. And so that idea of referring out to psychologists, referring out to doctors and saying this is beyond what I can do in my classroom.
And it's tough. You know, I just saw a really great speaker today, Rick Lavoie, and he was talking about how we don't teach teachers to deal with trauma. And not just with students, but also with parents. You know, parents who have students who have some of these behaviors, they're in trauma.
Right.
And he had a statement he said today that was just very powerful. It says, when you're hurting, you hurt others. I mean, that is a human condition. When we're upset, we lash out. And it's not intentional necessarily. And it's true for our students. It's true sometimes with some of those parents who are dealing with so much stress and trauma, and we don't often prepare teachers on how to deal with that. And just, I could always sleep at night if I felt like I was being respectful. You know, it's hard. It's so hard in that stress. And teachers need an outlet because teachers are under so much stress. So, you know, finding supports and whatever you can help you decompress if you're a teacher or a parent, finding time for yourself is critically important in some of those really hard pieces. The mental health one is really tricky. And there are some good groups out there. Wisconsin Family Ties is a statewide parent group working with mental health. They have great trainings for educators and families in that area, and there's a lot of good resources that can be out there. Well, we have really appreciated your time, Ellen. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for having me.
And just keep up the good work. Keep everything you're doing. We thank you for your time. You're welcome to email with us with questions. Please fill out any surveys. And we look forward to hopefully speaking with you again soon. Take care.